Queens, New York, 1927. On the outside, Ruth Snyder seemed like any other middle-class housewife of the Roaring Twenties. She lived in a modest home on 137th Street in the working-class neighborhood of Jamaica, Queens, with her husband, Albert Snyder, and their 9-year-old daughter, Lorraine. She attended church, doted on her child, and kept up appearances in a world where appearances meant everything. But appearances lie. Albert Snyder was a quiet, withdrawn man. He worked as the art editor for Motor Boating magazine, a publication devoted to the leisurely pursuits of the wealthy. At home, he was strict, emotionally cold, and unromantic. In fact, he still kept a photograph of his late fiancée, Jessie Gischard, displayed prominently in the house, long after marrying Ruth. Ruth hated that photograph. She resented living in a shrine to a dead woman. She resented being second best. She resented Albert. What began as silent contempt would grow into something far darker. Ruth wasn't content to play the obedient housewife. She longed for something more exciting, more dangerous. And in 1925, she met someone who offered that. Judd Gray was everything Albert wasn't: chatty, flirtatious, attentive. He was a traveling corset salesman from Syracuse, balding, bespectacled, and mild-mannered. He was also married and had a daughter of his own. Their affair started quickly and grew reckless. They rented hotel rooms under false names. They wrote torrid letters back and forth, letters that would later become damning evidence. Ruth began spinning a story. She told Gray that Albert was abusive, cruel, and threatening. She claimed her life was in danger. The only way out, she said, was if Albert was dead. At first, Gray resisted, but Ruth was persuasive. She told him, "You've got to do it for me." And eventually, Gray caved. They began to plan the murder. Before anything could happen, Ruth needed to ensure the death would be profitable. She convinced Albert to take out a $48,000 life insurance policy, about $800,000 today. Crucially, it included a double indemnity clause. If Albert died by accidental means, the payout would double. She told the insurer he traveled frequently and worked around dangerous printing equipment. None of it was true, but the paperwork went through. All she had to do now was wait. March 20th, 1927. Ruth gave Albert a heavy dose of chloral hydrate, a sedative, mixed into his prunes. As he began to drift into unconsciousness, she sent a message to Judd Gray. He arrived at the house around 2 a.m., carrying a sash weight, rubber gloves, and picture wire. Together, they set about staging a robbery. Scattered items and tied Ruth's hands and ankles with cords to make it look like she was a victim too. Then they went upstairs to kill Albert. Gray struck first, bludgeoning him in the head with the sash weight. But Albert wasn't dead. He groaned and tried to rise. Ruth helped hold him down. Gray wrapped picture wire around his neck and garroted him until he stopped breathing. They posed the body, finished staging the scene, and Gray slipped out quietly into the early morning streets of Queens. Ruth screamed and summoned the neighbors. The police arrived at first. Ruth played the part of the helpless widow. She told police that burglars had broken in and murdered her husband. But detectives quickly grew suspicious. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing was actually missing. Ruth's bindings were too loose, her demeanor too calm. And worst of all, she couldn't stop talking. She gave inconsistent answers, volunteered strange details, and seemed far more concerned with the insurance paperwork than with her husband's murder. Minutes later, detectives soon found Gray's name in Ruth's address book. When they confronted her, she cracked. She blamed Gray entirely. He had forced his way in, she said. He had killed Albert while she begged him to stop. But when the police found Gray in Syracuse, he had a different story. He told them Ruth had masterminded everything. She drugged Albert. She tied herself up. She had even struck Albert herself. It became a game of he said, she said, but the evidence didn't lie. They had left fingerprints, letters, hotel registrations. Ruth had even written a fake burglary note on a typewriter and tried to destroy it. Police recovered it from a trash can. The lovers were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The Snyder-Gray trial began in April 1927, and it was a media circus. Reporters packed the courtroom. Headlines screamed scandal. The case had everything: sex, betrayal, violence, and a deadly dame. Ruth was branded the blonde fiend and the ice woman by the press. She showed no remorse in court. She was cold, calculating, and sometimes even smiled. Jurors hated her. Gray, on the other hand, appeared meek and frightened. He painted himself as a weak-willed man seduced by a dangerous woman. Their love letters were read aloud. Lines like, "You are mine forever," and "Nothing matters but our love" became national punchlines. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just over an hour. Both were found guilty of first-degree murder. Both were sentenced to death. On January 12, 1928, Ruth Snyder was led to the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. What happened next became one of the most infamous moments in American journalism. Tom Howard, a reporter for the New York Daily News, had smuggled a miniature camera into the death chamber, strapped to his ankle. As Ruth was strapped in and the switch was flipped, Howard triggered the shutter. The next day, the Daily News published the grainy, haunting photo of Ruth Snyder at the moment of her execution under the massive headline, "Dead." It was the first time the American public had seen a person executed in real time. The image shocked the nation. Some were horrified. Others couldn't look away. Judd Gray followed her to the chair shortly after. He, too, was electrocuted. Quietly, without fanfare. The Snyder-Gray case left a lasting impact on American culture. It inspired novels and films, most famously James M. Cain's Double Indemnity, later adapted into a classic film noir. The tropes of the femme fatale, the insurance murder plot, and the doomed lovers all stem from this real case. The photo of Ruth Snyder remains one of the most iconic and controversial images in journalism history. But more than that, it left behind a cautionary tale. A reminder of what can happen when passion curdles into obsession, when greed poisons love, and when two ordinary people convince themselves they can outsmart justice.